Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Leaders and Friends. Today, my guest is Rob Portman. Sometimes life just takes all kinds of funny turns. Rob and I met each other as 18-year-olds in college. We've been friends now for 50 years. Our paths intersected a number of different times, but you guys all know Rob as one of the finest public servants of our generation, another great Cincinnati guy, and just a wonderful human being. So, Rob, welcome. It's great to have you on Leaders and Friends, and I look forward to a good conversation.
Thanks, Jeff. I look forward to it also. I have to note that we were 18 years old when we met, and then we went through college together. And Jeff was the star math pupil and starting offensive tackle on the football team. And he was Mr. Big Man on campus. Uh, so he was a guy I look up to. On the other hand, it took me 5 years to get through. I finally did. But seriously, Jeff, it's great to be on with you.
Great to know with you, Rob. So just maybe it's always fun to kind of start with our guests to kind of talk about how they got to kind of the world that you were in for so long. So how did you evolve to become a congressman and a senator and get into public life?
Well, I had no one in my family who had been in politics or much less politics, but even a lawyer. So when I became a lawyer, my dad thought I was crazy. He was a small business guy, as you know. And when I got into politics, he thought I was even crazier. So I didn't like come at it the way a lot of people do through their family. But I always cared about public service and wanted to be able to fix things. My mom reminds me that when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I was driving with her down the streets in Cincinnati where we had plenty of potholes, saying, "Mom, I want to fix these potholes someday." And after 30 years of public service, I never got to fix a damn pothole. So, I didn't achieve that. Although the infrastructure bill, I guess, that I co-authored could be called pothole filling. Um, so it just came because I was interested in public service, and I didn't know that I'd be in elected office, but I always had in the back of my mind, I wanted to serve in that way. I was in government and student government in high school and college at Dartmouth and at in law school. So I guess that kind of indicated that I might be interested. And timing is everything in life, as you have said, but particularly in politics.
Mhm.
And so I was fortunate when I was relatively young, 34 years old. My congressman resigned unexpectedly and endorsed me to replace him. That was Bill Bradison, you remember, who had served us for
Mhm.
18 years in
Yeah,
Cincinnati.
yeah.
So I probably would never have gotten into it except for the fact that there I was, given this great opportunity to serve. And I did serve for 12 years in the House and then served in two administrations, the Bush one and Bush two administration, and then also was able to serve in the Senate for 2 terms for 12 years.
And talk about the difference, Rob, between serving a president in the White House versus being in Congress. Like what was different about each assignment? What did you like about each assignment?
Well, first of all, it is really nice to have that perspective from both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. And it turns out not many people have it. Normally members of Congress don't end up in administration and vice versa. So it was interesting. I'm the first U.S. trade representative or budget director, I guess, ever to become an elected official at all, maybe, and certainly a U.S. senator. And there's a reason for that. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions on the executive side that make it harder to translate into, political messages back home. But I love both, Jeff. I really um, miss the constituents part of the public service that I did in the House and Senate, 12, 24 years of being out at town hall meetings and going to parades and fairs and just meeting some really interesting people, factory tours of your factories and others. And so that was really cool. And that's what Jane and I miss the most. But on the other hand, in the administration, you had the ability to manage more people and to lead and to be able to make decisions without going through all the rigmarole you do on the legislative side. So I was an active legislator, but it might take 2 to 3 years to get a project done. Whereas in the executive branch, you can move pretty quickly within the constraints of an
Mhm.
executive. And our Constitution makes that pretty clear that the Congress has to actually pass laws in order to, as an example, funding for anything has to go through the House of Representatives first and Congress. And but there are a lot of things you can get done in the executive branch, and that was fun too. And I love the teams. My team at the trade job and also at the budget job were I would say, bright, capable career people who were um, kind of self-chosen. In other words, they really believed in the mission, and I will always be very grateful to having had those experiences, and I stay in touch with a lot of them today.
That's great. In the Senate, Rob, with 100 huge egos, like, how do you lead each other? What can you teach people about how to lead, peers, when the visibility and stakes are so high?
I think it's developing trust relationships and, frankly, humility, which is hard to come by, as you say, in politics generally, maybe in the Senate particularly.
Yeah.
But as an example, giving people credit. When someone does something, not to grab credit for yourself, but go out of your way to give them credit. The next time you work with that person, you will find that person to be, much more willing to work with you and to get things done and provide credit generally to others. So I'm watching House of Cards for the third time right now in my free time,
Yeah.
and it's kind of a imaginary Washington. It doesn't really exist, but one part that's somewhat true is this notion that working with your colleagues, you have to let them feel like they're part of it and that they get some benefit from it. And that's true, in your leadership roles and in others as well. But particularly, as you say, with 100 high school class presidents in the United States Senate, all of whom have pretty healthy egos, and so it's a matter of working with them, and I think over time too, it takes a couple years at least. People get to know you. You develop a relationship. Either it's all about you or it's all about the team. And if you're a team player, I think you have more success in the Senate in terms of legislating.
Yep. You were the U.S. trade rep. You spent a lifetime on globalization and trade. How did we all let kind of globalization, do you think, Rob, become a negative instead of a positive when you reflect? Because there's probably nobody I would, if for any of the people out there that worked at GE, you were instrumental in helping us win business around the world that created jobs in Ohio and other places, but it's all kind of gotten turned on its head. So when you
Yeah.
reflect back, what do you think happened, and what can we all learn?
Well, first, Jeff, and you know this better than anybody, there's always been this tension between the sort of macroeconomic trade philosophy, which is comparative advantage, as it's called. So the country that makes it the best and most efficiently should make it. Um, and that meant for many workers in Ohio and around the country, the opposite side of that, which was we're losing our jobs because we're shifting manufacturing overseas, as an example. So I would go to the GE then aviation plant and talk to the union workers there, and I would explain to them that your jobs are here primarily because of international sales, and this is good for us to trade. And yeah, we have to do some things overseas in terms of the service side of the business. You would know more about that than I would by far, but generally speaking, this is good for American jobs, and therefore you should be supportive of whatever it was, the NAFTA trade agreement, or whatever. And there was a lot of skepticism. And it turns out, in my view, a lot of that skepticism was warranted. In other words, we kind of went too far and didn't protect ourselves in terms of having a supply chain that was reliable, but also insisting on fairness in trade. So if another country, as an example, was selling it below its cost or dumping or was subsidizing, we didn't have effective ways to counter that. Now that's gotten better. The trade laws have improved. I actually worked with Sherrod Brown, who was a Democrat, on some trade laws that got passed, including the so-called Level the Playing Field Act that's helped to make that level playing field more a reality. But I think American workers and American communities that were disproportionately impacted by trade, stood up and let their voices be heard. And there are negative consequences to globalization, let's be honest. And yet the macroeconomic benefits are obvious too. And so you got to figure out, a way forward there. The way that I started to talk about it the last 4 or 5 years in the Senate was to look at it in terms of balanced trade. So not free trade, not protectionist, fair trade, but so-called, but balanced trade, where the United States, sticks up for itself and ensures that countries we trade with are dealing with us fairly, but we don't punish countries arbitrarily. And that's that balance. And specifically, Section 232, you may remember President Trump used against steel and aluminum. In some cases, that was merited because there was unfair trade going on. But under 232, all you have to prove is there's a national security interest, which he simply asserted, and his administration asserted. And that's difficult to do, because then you have retaliation against you, and you sort of move away from the fairness side of it. On the other hand, with regard to China on Section 301, I thought President Trump did the right thing in the sense of saying, here's our report under 301 showing unfairness, specifically subsidization and dumping. And in that case, I think we have to be tougher. So it's a balance, right, Jeff? I mean, we want to be sure that we are interacting with the world. It's in the interest of our consumers and our businesses, our farmers who love to export, our industrial workers who are doing better and better in terms of bringing advanced manufacturing back here and competing with the world. But it's got to be done on a level playing field basis. And
I agree. I totally agree with you, Rob. I think to a certain extent, business leaders fumbled this one as well, in terms of, we always followed the rules, but we weren't as cognizant always of the impact some of these things had on our workforce. And I think at the end of the day, we didn't do our part either, right? So I think it shouldn't be a surprise that we are where we are right now.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, it means a slightly higher cost for consumers, all the way from the toy to the jet engine.
Yeah.
But it also means that over time you have a more reliable supply chain, as we saw during COVID. Obviously, that accentuated a problem that was out there all along. And so, that's part of the pros and cons of this as well, is if you have balanced trade where you are going after unfair trade and you are making more stuff in America, your costs are going to be a little higher, but you also have this sense of security, particularly on strategic things like jet engines, that you're not giving away the store, and that you can get the supply chain materials you need to be able to be competitive. So I think we're working through it in a more constructive way now. And my hope is that when President Trump comes back into office, that he will get back into the business of trade agreements. The one thing the Biden administration did poorly, in my view, was to reach out and try to achieve more markets for our workers, our farmers, our ranchers, and so on, our service providers. They did no trade agreements, including in the Trans-Pacific area, but also finishing the UK agreement as an example, or finishing an agreement with Japan. I think the administration has the ability to do that. They're talking about tariffs. They're talking about other efforts that might seem more protectionist, but they also have a history with USMCA and with the agreement they almost reached with the UK. And USMCA is a successor to NAFTA, to say, let's get back into business. And the reason that's important is because other countries are doing that. And so literally Americans are being disadvantaged because our products are more expensive in these third countries. We don't get the benefits of the lower tariffs that other countries do. And the Europeans have been aggressive in trade agreements. The Chinese have been very aggressive in trade agreements. And they're beginning to sort of elbow out the American exporters. So it's time for us to get back in the game.
Yeah. No, I agree. Hey, when you were a senator, Rob, what was your best day and what was your worst day when you were in the Senate?
Oh, wow. My best day was always, passing something that seemed like it was significant and meaningful. And I was fortunate. Over 200 of my bills were signed into law by either President Obama, President Biden, or President Trump. And some were very small, that no one would ever notice. Others were pretty historic. And, the national parks, as an example, were really struggling, still are, with regard to infrastructure. And the cost was just mounting, and our parks are being used a lot more now. And yet, the water systems, the road systems, the energy systems are all breaking down, the lodges and so on. So we found a way to get money from offshore drilling, the royalties, into the parks. And it was bipartisan. President Trump signed it, and it's making a huge difference. I'm now in the National Parks Foundation, so I'm seeing it from the outside. I'm seeing these projects being implemented, and the trails are being fixed that were eroding. The roads and the bridges and so on are being fixed, and that's it's meaningful because the parks are, as some have said, America's greatest invention. I mean, they're open to everybody, and they're just a wonderful way for us as Americans to demonstrate to the rest of the world that we have a great system. And yet they were falling apart, and nobody was interested in those kinds of fixes, because it's much more glamorous to expand a park or to have another naturalist, but not to actually fix the underlying problem.
Right.
So anyway, that's one small example of something that when that passes, you feel like, maybe I did something for future generations.
Mhm. Worst day.
Worst day, it's always the same, which is the politics. Politics is a necessary evil in my view, and obviously you got to win to be able to serve. But there's a lot of BS in politics, and you're asked to participate in that. With your emails and your letters and you're not so much in office, but during campaigns where you got to just go after the other side and the ads and all that stuff. Um, that's not the most fun part of
Yeah.
elected office to me. That was always, again, the means to an end, which is to
The
make a
necessary
difference.
evil. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
agree.
And
Um,
fundraising, by the way,
yeah,
fundraising used to be from wealthier individuals primarily. Now it's more online. And when you look at it in this last couple cycles, more money was raised online than from individuals who would be considered major donors. And so that might be 30, 40, $50 online, maybe a couple times, maybe 3 or 4 times from millions of people. And in a way that's good. It sort of democratizes fundraising. But in
mhm.
a way it's bad because the messages you have to use to get those people to give you the 30, 40, $50 tend to be pretty strident.
Yeah.
And when I was thinking about running again for my third term, my folks came to me and said, Rob, you're gonna have to raise a lot more money online. That's where most money is raised now. And you got to change your messaging. Like these emails are really boring. They're about policy. Nobody cares. You got to go after the other side that they're going to ruin America.
Rob, how much money, when you look at Moreno versus Sherrod Brown, how much money was in that campaign?
I'm told it's between $5 and $600 million, which would be the
For
largest
just the
amount,
state of Ohio.
ever expended. It's the most expensive Senate race in the history of our country.
Yeah.
And most of that money was raised, at least on the Democrat side, through these online messages. And again, you have to kind of go out there on the extreme in order to do that successfully. So then you land in Washington, you said all these things, or you've taken all these positions. So I think
Right.
in a way that kind of fundraising is adding to the division and the inability to find common ground to solve problems.
No doubt. So what, President Trump won again in early November. Nothing's a landslide anymore, but a pretty convincing victory, you'd have to say. So what should that teach us? I always used to sit around, Rob, and say, not what did we see, but what does it mean? And
Mhm.
so what does it mean in terms of where we are as a country, politically, and things like that?
Yeah. Well, look, congratulations to him and to his team. They ran a very effective campaign, including a grassroots campaign. They were criticized for not having much on the grassroots. They actually did have quite a bit, it turned out, in these 7 swing states. Roughly 100,000 people, really got a lot of messages from the Trump campaign, and it worked. But I think 3 things, Jeff. One, this was a change election, and this is a global phenomenon. So you look what happened in the UK recently, or what happened in France, or what's happening in Germany right now. I mean, people around the world, and you could also look to some of the developing countries even, are kind of taking a more populist view, a more nationalist view, and saying, we need a change. And sometimes it's liberal to conservative, sometimes it's conservative to liberal. So you look at the UK, it actually went, from conservative to labor. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that this election was a change election. And
Right.
what President Trump did successfully, although he had served previously, was to align Vice President Harris with the Biden administration as the status quo. And he was, fighting against the status quo. And she allowed him to do that by running, in my view, a poor campaign in the sense of not separating herself where she thought she could. Remember when she was on, what was it, The View or something? And they said, tell us one thing where you differ from the Biden administration. And she couldn't think of one. So that's one.
Yeah.
Number 2, I do think on the issues matrix, President Trump had the better positions in terms of where the American people are. So not only were people frustrated looking for a change, but they thought that what was happening at the border and immigration was absolutely unacceptable, and it is. And second, they thought that the economy and inflation needed to be tamed, and that was something that was laid at the feet, as it always is, of the administration in office. but specifically because they had put forward policies that helped to increase inflation. So I think the change election, the notion that these issues were ones that Donald Trump was out there on. Those are the two top issues in most states. Abortion was not one of the top three issues in most states. Certainly not in Ohio.
Right.
And then third, I do think that there was a pushback against, and I'll just generalize here, sort of what people viewed as unreasonable positions on the left, sort of the woke culture, and that was, I think, summarized by the Trump campaign well in terms of the public safety issue, for instance. For apart from immigration, just that how could we not be more concerned about this? And there was a sense that we'd just gone too far. Women sports and men being able to participate, or men using biological men using bathrooms that were women's bathrooms, those sorts of things, I think, were another part of the Trump train, where people who might normally have sat out the election, or might normally have voted for a Democrat, were just had enough. So I think I don't know, that's my view of it. Everybody has their own interpretation, and that's fair because the polls are kind of not convincing as to what was the issue. But
yeah, no, that's the other part, is like how do you read it anymore? It's I think you have to have your own people on the ground listening, because the media has just been completely disconnected from
they have
what people are thinking.
And it's interesting because I figured, having been disconnected for the last two elections, and frankly, under representing the Trump support, particularly in 2020 and 2016, that this time pollsters would be very careful about their methodology to try to be more accurate. And yet we saw it again. I mean, there was no poll that I saw that showed all 7 swing states going to Trump, as an example. So once again, they underpolled the Trump voter, and I haven't seen any good analysis as to why, but I can kind of guess part of it is that people aren't interested in talking to pollsters who are Trump supporters, so they don't answer their phones.
Yeah. Talk about, Rob, what you're working on today. I know you still have your hands in education and trying to make the country better. Tell us about what you're working on right now.
Well, I've got this thing called the Portman Center at the University of Cincinnati. It's called the Center for Policy Solutions, and Jeff Immelt is one of my early supporters. Thank you. God bless you. But it's about, how do we find common ground again? And it used to be more common. In 30 years of public service, what I saw, the biggest change was the inability for the right and the left to come together and actually solve problems. So let's take the border as an example. Not since the mid-1980s have we written any legislation that helps on the border. And, finally, I think that's starting to get closer, and maybe we'll figure it out. But that common ground is hard to find because both sides maybe see an advantage to the status quo, which is terrible for America, terrible for the flow of fentanyl into our country, terrible for the flow of illegals who might be on the terror watch list, and so on. And just it's disorderly in terms of our immigration policy. But to solve it requires the right and the left to find common ground, which is harder and harder to do. But I think the debt and deficit's an even better example, maybe, because it's one we've talked about for, again, decades and just can't get our hands around. And it's so obvious to all of us that $36 trillion debt and annual deficits of $1.5 trillion just aren't sustainable. But how do you come together to solve these problems? Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and then the spending generally, and the revenue side. So the notion of the Portman Center is to try to say, is there a way in which we can help move the political system? This is a tall order, but try to bend the curve a little bit toward working together more. And that's bipartisanship and it's civility and all that. But for me, it's policy. It's about, the reason it's so important is that we're not tackling the big issues like we should. So we have a bunch of Portman fellows who are students. We have about 20 of them who are terrific and really inspiring, and they have to go through this process of kind of learning about how you can legislate together. Again, I was fortunate to be able to do a lot of that with both sides of the aisle when I was in. So we have some examples we use. And then nationally, we're working with some groups to look at the various factors, including the fundraising we talked about, but also primaries. And I know a lot of folks focus on redistricting, and that's important too. But honestly, the American people themselves are kind of dividing by geography these days. So if
Right.
you go in rural Ohio, it's likely to be red. Urban Ohio, it's likely to be blue, and the suburbs is where the fight is. But in terms of primaries, very few people vote in primaries.
Right.
There's a data point out there showing that about 8% of the voters are electing about 80% of the members of Congress, meaning that if you have a red district or a blue district or a red state or blue state, which is increasingly the case, and you have this relatively small group of people voting in the primary, that's what matters. The general election is almost an afterthought. And so you're not really getting people who are representative of the district or
Yeah.
the state out of
Yeah.
that system. So we're looking at that and other
Who would be
issues.
a speaker, Rob? Like, I know you have a speaker series. Give me an example of somebody that might come and speak.
Well, we had Joe Manchin come speak a couple
Okay,
weeks
great.
ago, which was fun.
Yeah.
He's always very entertaining, and he's unplugged now. He's not running again, so
That's great.
he was hilarious. We've had Heidi Heitkamp come, who's a
Nice.
former
Yeah.
Democrat senator from North Dakota, and she's now heading up a group in Chicago that it's a public affairs center that is a lot like what we're trying to do, but much
Right.
broader and much better funded. And you're in
Yeah.
Chicago, but she came in, and Kirsten Sinema came in, who again is an independent
Nice.
now, but was a Democrat, and she and I were the co-authors of the infrastructure bill. So we talked about how that thing happened.
Yeah.
After again 3 or 4 or 5 decades of talking about it, we finally were able to figure out a way to have the right and the left come together. We had an interesting one last week. We had the author of a new book called Character Matters come in, and she is the former chief of staff to President George H.W. Bush, so the first
Mm.
Bush 41. And the book's all vignettes about his character.
Mm.
And I think people would enjoy it. One of the vignettes I told and wrote about, which was when I was a young staffer working for him. And I watched him through this whole issue of watch my lips, no new taxes, and then saying, we have to have a deal here on this
Right.
out of control deficit, which was $200 billion a year.
That's
It was like
right.
nothing compared to
Yeah.
today. And he was willing to put revenues on the table in exchange for real cuts in spending. And lo and behold, that happened in 1990. But by the end of the 90s, because those cuts were in place, it enabled us to get to a balanced budget.
Yeah.
So it really did foundationally help move the country in the right
I
direction.
think the
But he lost his
deficit and
election.
immigration, Rob, those are two things that the center, if we could ever make any progress on either one of those, I think those are two things that are really going to shape our children's
Absolutely. Yeah,
generation.
absolutely.
We're as we leave here today, you and I met when we were 18 years old. What advice would you give an 18-year-old, and you've got kids of your own, but thinking about what advice would you give somebody growing up today about the U.S., about careers and things like that, about leadership?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you and I were very fortunate. We went to this nice Ivy League college and got a great liberal arts education. Um, as I said earlier, you were the big man on campus
I
and
wouldn't
went on
say
to
that.
great things. But
Yeah.
um, that's not for everybody. I mean, I really think there's so many opportunities out there right now for young people to go into the trades, as an example. Uh, I'm involved. I'm on the board of the Bechtel company, which is one of the largest contractors in the world, desperate for workers all the time. And these are, relatively high tech jobs now. A lot of them are considered middle technology jobs, as some call them, or middle skills jobs, but they demand, a pretty high level of technological background, but they don't demand a college degree. You have to get a certificate typically to get one of these jobs, but you can also learn a lot on the job. Ohio has a great CTE program, the Career and Technical Education program, in our high schools. So I would encourage young people to take advantage of that.
Mhm.
The CTE programs, the community college programs, getting a certificate, getting into work, whether it's a hospital tech, whether it's a software engineer, whether it's a welder, whether it's a bricklayer or a carpenter. There's so many jobs out there that are wanting right now, and there's a lot of demand. So the wages are quite good, and you can afford that car, you can afford that house, you can afford,
Right.
and you
Right.
aren't picking up all this huge college debt. One of my projects that I didn't get done when I was there, which I wish I had, which was bipartisan, was to allow the government help, particularly Pell Grants, to be used for these certificates. Why should a Pell Grant just be used to get a degree? It should be used to help young people be able to follow their dreams. So that's my thing right now. I'm talking about a lot when I'm out there is
Yeah.
to really look at some of these options. And by the way, it does not preclude going to college at all. In fact, your employer may well pay for it. And I know plenty of young people who have done that. Some, at GE as an example, you start, with a GE internship or a co-op, and eventually GE may well turn around and pay for you to become an
sure.
engineer. So I think this is one thing that is underutilized right now. But in
I think that's
general,
a great advice.
engage,
Yeah.
get involved. You were always involved, Jeff. I remember when you took over the healthcare business. I think it was up in Milwaukee, and you came down to lobby Congress and testify. And I remember having lunch with you in the members' dining room, and I said, you must be really busy with work, and you were, but you said this is important too. Everybody's got to engage, and
Yeah,
it's a democracy only if we if we make it so by
yeah.
being involved. Vote in primaries. I mean, people that don't vote and then complain about what they end up with. People say, "Gosh, out of 330 million people, couldn't we have gotten two better candidates this last time?" Well, these candidates won, and in their respective states, or in case of Donald Trump for president twice. So, they were very convincing to people. But if you don't get involved yourself in voting in primaries,
Yeah.
then you only have yourself to blame.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, Rob, thanks very much for a great discussion. My mother and father were your biggest fans. They always were so proud of you. My mom used to say that Robbie Portman is so handsome. I'll vote for him any day.
That was a long time ago.
Listen, I'm proud of the man you've been and all the
Likewise,
great
Jeff.
work you've done, and wish you great success. And I look forward to seeing you hopefully in Cincinnati sometime soon.
That'd be great. Thanks, pal. Good to be with you.
Good seeing you, buddy.
Take care.